I want to know why everyone I know has gone Slime City. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live. I'm here with the host, Lauren the Unborn Dixon, and I am his co-host, Sam Carlson. And we have Greg Lamberson, director of Slime City, on the show today. Thank you for being here, Greg.
I'm happy to be here. We should let everyone know that I'm presented in 70 millimeter so that I can be closer to my microphone and people can hear me. I'm not trying to look on anybody's desk or sneak a peek at anything. I just want to be heard.
Slime City in IMAX would be amazing.
The world isn't ready for it.
Speaking of slime, I do have to present this. I have a non-alcoholic Slimerita for this occasion.
Very nice.
Yeah, according to my husband, it tastes like a mixture of key lime, like if you broke up a bunch of key lime pie candies and then mixed them with Tums.
Do you have some Midori in there?
Huh?
Do you have some Midori in there? Is that what's made of green?
No, I am a sober person, so it's completely non-alcoholic, but we've got some margarita, the little non-alcoholic margarita pouches in there. Mm-hmm. And then there's also Jell-O has this thing which is edible slime, and that's giving it that color.
Perfect.
And there's also some LaCroix in there because I'm a basic ass bitch over here. But I think that actually works out really well. The carbonation's going to help settle your stomach because this movie's fucking gross.
It's non-expirable, the real thing, so you can let it sit as long as you want.
Exactly. I mean, it's just going to be... I mean, eventually, like, if you just let the yogurt sit there, it's just going to make cheese.
That could be Slime City 3.
Exactly.
We'll get there. That's on the list. That's on the notes. Greg, hey, it's amazing to sit down with you. We go back a ways in the same orbit, back to Shocklines days, which was a message board between people involved in the horror business, mainly on the literary side. But you were one of those guys that straddled both sides of it, the film and the books. And I found that to be a welcome departure and distraction from some of the internal politics of that board at times. I saw Slime City as a teenager on a very badly dubbed VHS tape because it was a generational bootleg that a friend of a friend of a friend had made. And the one thing I can remember is that the audio was so bad on that version that when I actually saw the film looking pretty decent for the first time, I was like, wow, there's like a story. Because originally it was basically a silent film with just this distorted soundtrack. But we weren't watching really for the dialogue at that age anyway, so it was all good. But watching it on this tiny television in a friend's house, it was Forbidden Fruit. He was the guy who set me up with Cannibal Holocaust and Necromantic and all of the stable foods of a healthy teenage boy. And Slime City was different because it felt more like something like Return of the Deadly Spawn, or where it was embracing its low-budget aesthetic in a way that felt very punk rock to me. It felt very human and very made by people who would enjoy this stuff. And that was very different than Hollywood's movies. You're talking about 88 and 89. You're talking about, the Freddy sequel years where everything was a little bit too glossy and a little bit too marketed, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, I was a teenager when I wrote Slime City. I was 18, and I shot it when I was 21, and it took 2 years to finish. So I was 23 by the time you saw it. I actually managed a movie theater that showed The Deadly Spawn, so that was an influence. And in fact, I only went to film school for 1 year, School of Visual Arts in New York City, with Jim Euro, who directed Street Trash, and our mutual teacher was Roy Frumkus, who produced and wrote Street Trash. And at that time, Basket Case and Evil Dead and The Deadly Spawn were all in theaters. They were 16 millimeter films. And I didn't want to be making Super 8 films or 16 millimeter shorts for college. I wanted to get in on that. And so after 1 year, I gave up film school. I wrote that script. And I didn't know what to do next. So my next step was to work for free on a film called I Was a Teenage Zombie and learn the production aspects of making a film. But my script was ready to go.
That's another film with soundtrack issues, right?
That film has a great score, actually. It has Las
the music.
Lobos and all these
Yeah,
bands.
Enigma Records put it out, which
The
tells
sound
you
isn't that bad. I mean, all these 16 millimeter films, you got to realize the space that they allow for a soundtrack is much smaller than what's on a 35 millimeter film. So there's definitely a difference. Plus, we were all amateurs. But as you said, once you see it on a different format, it sounds a lot better. I couldn't watch Slime City on VHS for years, largely because of the square image. But there was also kind of a hum on my VHS copy, and I believe that's what they put on the screeners that they sent out to people, so that if they did dupe them, they'd have a defective product.
And I think a lot of people had the experience like me of seeing a generational version of that defect, like enhanced in every generation.
Yeah.
Fascinating. It might have actually helped the film in a strange sort of way, though, because it became kind of a legendary underground film.
For many reasons it did. And for many years it was unavailable because the distributor went to prison. He's still in prison. He was a porn distributor, and I just knew he disappeared and the money stopped coming in. I heard rumors that he was in witness protection or that the mob had whacked him, and no, it just turned out he was in prison for a double homicide. But because of that, my film was unavailable for many years. And during that period, I was managing a movie theater in New York City, the 86th Street East Theater. And I heard that there was a video store up in the Bronx where we shot some of the movie, where they were just running off dupes and selling them to anyone who wanted it. And I was fine with that because I wasn't making money anyways, and at least people were watching it and enjoying it.
I'm pretty sure that Kim's Underground in St. Mark's was selling it for many, many years.
Well, here a bit of irony. When it played as a midnight movie, it played at the Bleecker Street Cinemas, which was located upstairs from where Kim's Underground was. And as often happens, I had this pattern in my life where I would quit my jobs to work on a movie until I absolutely needed money to keep making the film or survive. And then I would get a job in a video store to make myself employable again. And then I would move on to a movie theater management job, which was really how I made my living. But I spent about 6 months working at Kim's Underground, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. So in my time, I worked at Kim's Underground. I started Two Boots Video. I was the first manager there for a year. I was a manager at the Angelica, at the Paris. So I had a history of working primarily for institutions in New York City. Although once in a while I would get stuck doing a very brief tour at Blockbuster or something like that, some shitty chain.
Well, I saw so many great films at the Angelica. And in fact, the Angelica owns a few theaters, including one in Manville, New Jersey, where I still see a lot of things, including most of the genre Indian cinema that comes through. So they're still fighting the good fight somewhat.
Well, when I was there, they were the only ones. Eventually, somebody else bought them and turned them into a chain. In fact, we have a theater in downtown Buffalo. It just changed hands again, but their lobby is a replica of the Angelica that I worked at in New York City because they were briefly part of that chain.
Wow, the Angelica is absolutely, I don't know, it's a part of New York culture that's ingrained deep. And for people who are not from the area, you have to understand that this was a theater that would play art films primarily, but then they would also do imports and some exotic films and some genre films if they had an angle to them.
Right.
And it was a fascinating way to be able to see Japanese gangster films one week and then like a lo-fi like nihilist art film the next. So I love the Angelica.
The fascinating thing about that theater was that you took an escalator to the lower level where the 6 small auditoriums were, and that's how they were able to make their money. And that theater made a lot of money. It was the highest grossing theater in the country for several years. But watching a movie, it was right next to a subway. And every time a train went by, the whole theater would rumble. And it had this classy feeling otherwise. And in fact, that building had been the repair station for the New York City subway line. And in the basement were catacombs that led to subway tunnels. And some of the kids who worked there had followed one of the tunnels all the way to 34th Street. I never was that daring because there were rats everywhere. But it was really interesting underneath.
And the time period you're talking about was New York, obviously pre-Giuliani. So you're talking about a rougher
90s.
environment period.
Yeah, well, early 90s, right around the time of Giuliani.
Oh, right around. So not Dinkins.
I was there for 21 years. So
Yes, both.
the different mayors do blend together. Although I will tell you, when I worked at the 86th Street East Theater on 86th and 3rd Avenue, I was there for 7 years. Mayor Koch came all the time. And Giuliani came before he was mayor. After he became mayor, his son would come with a private detail. Spoiled little kid. But when Giuliani came by himself, he was just this quiet guy. And, he'd just give you like a little embarrassed wave and walk in to see a movie by himself. That was around the time that he left his wife and he was living with some gay friends and making the tabloids every day with every move he made. He was just happy to get alone for a little while.
That guy has had a fascinating life that needs
it
needs to be told without the political bias on either side, I think, because he's just one of those guys that oversaw a part of history of New York, and it's going to be a fascinating ride when the story is finally written, I think.
Yeah, there was a lot to him even before he became New York's mayor. I think for our current reference points, we think of him beginning with when he was New York City's mayor, but there's a whole lot before that.
Dude took on the mob. I mean,
all by himself, he would have us believe.
Well, that might be pushing it, but so Dan Shine of Flesh Wound Features has a question for you. He says, "Can you tell us a little bit about Johnny Gruesome, novel and film? I met you years back at a convention. I've been a fan since Slime City."
Sure. Well, I wrote the screenplay for Johnny Gruesome right after I wrote the screenplay for Slime City, but before I made Slime City. And Vestron Pictures, which was just exploding, they were the biggest VHS label. They met with me about making the movie. And I showed up, this 18-year-old kid, without the faintest idea on how to conduct himself at a business meeting. They said no. And my plan was to either make Johnny Gruesome for $500,000 or make Slime City for $50,000. So I ended up making Slime City. Many years later, 10, 20 years later, I took that script and I expanded it into a novel, a much gorier, more detailed novel. And I figured, okay, now I've got this thing out of my system. But after I made Killer Rack, which was around 2015, said, I don't want to wait for this thing to become a cult film. I want to make my next film now. And I was able to raise, still not what I wanted for that film. I raised about almost $300,000. And we shot it here in Buffalo, about an hour away from the town I grew up in, which is what the story was supposed to be set in. And the film we made was basically taken from the original script without all the added material that I created for the novel. I think the novel is probably the definitive version. And it was my first time working with enough of a budget to have a fully paid crew and some union actors, and definitely a step up in terms of production value. But the distribution was no better than it's been for my $50,000 films. So the film's out there. You can watch it for free on Tubi, and you can get the novel, if not from some used bookstore, from me directly, because my publisher, Medallion Press, who published all 12 of my novels, they went under about 4 years ago now.
Medallion are a fascinating story because they were traditionally a romance publisher who decided that horror was the next big thing and gave quite a few years of trying to make it so. But like a lot of publishers discover, horror takes a lot of work to really get yourself involved in the community if you're going to have a long-standing goodwill. But we miss everyone. We miss every publisher who used to publish horror, whether they went under, whether they abandoned it. We miss you all. Come back, please.
Well, Medallion had an even more interesting history than that, because the owner of the company, Helen Roseberg, had published a romance novel with Kensington, maybe, or whatever the romance arm of Leisure was at that time. And she was so unhappy with the way that they treated her book that she formed her own company. And it did become a romance publisher, and they did get into horror. Their problem was really they got into all sorts of media ventures that they weren't really familiar with. And a friend of mine said, they produced their own TV show. There was Medallion Mondays, a weekly web series. And a friend of mine watched. He goes, I've got this company figured out. It's WKRP in Cincinnati, and the owner is Mama Carlson. And that really is pretty much what it was. I mean, they had a ball. I love them Every book I did for them got a bigger advance than the last. I could write anything I wanted. I was keeping up basically on a leisure schedule. I was doing a book every 9 months. So I did 12 novels for them over 6 years. And anything I wanted to do, they let me do. They took me to Book Expo America. Almost every summer, they took me to Fan Expo Canada in Toronto, the big Comic-Con out there. And they would give out these chapbooks, basically, that excerpts from my novels. And if you've ever done a con and you've spent your time sitting at a table twiddling your thumbs while people walk by, it's a whole different ball game when there's a sales team there and they're bringing people over, whether they want your book or not, and they're getting them to buy stuff and giving away T-shirts and huge crowds at Fan Expo. And I developed a real following from people who look forward to seeing me there every year. It was great. And then they changed. They decided to get into publishing a culture magazine, and the books fell by the wayside. And a year later, it was all over. And it's the way. Very often, when publishers go under, the authors are the last to know it. So there was a lot of frantic maneuvering to find out what's going on. I actually formed a sort of a help group on Facebook with the authors to try and reach out to all these authors. There were 500 of them, at least, that the bankruptcy attorney had to get hold of, and she had no idea how. And I'm explaining to the bankruptcy attorney how publishing works and how you've got to now remove all of our books from Amazon so we can do another publisher. It's not just enough to give us our rights back. And it was cool of them, first of all, to make sure that we did get our rights back. A lot of authors have to fight like crazy for that to happen. But I ended up paying for a truck to pick up 200 copies each of all 12 of my books, drive them across country. They gave me the books for free. And now my wife is so glad that I've got boxes of books all over. There's that scene in that Dolomite movie with Eddie Murphy where his mom's complaining about the boxes of unsold records and stuff. Well, that's nothing compared to what I have in my house.
I might have some boxes full of books too.
I would be like, I was going to look right at you, Lauren.
Well, listen, this is recent. My publisher just died back in February, Cutting Block Books, and they did give 30 days warning to their writers. At least I got it, so I'm assuming all of them got it. But definitely, it puts you in a position because if you want remaining stock, you can get a hold of it.
Yep.
But I mean, what you do with it from that point on becomes an open question, because certainly you want the book out there, but you hope also to be able to build something off of those copies still too, which is the hard part of it. Hey, Griffin in the chat has a great question. Can you read this, Sam?
Yeah. All right, Greg, what, in your opinion, are the top 3 films that best represent New York City? And why are they all Ghostbusters? Sorry, Griffin.
Number 1 is Taxi Driver. Number 2 is the original King Kong.
Yes, I love that movie.
And it pains me to say this because this was once one of my favorite films, and now I can't even watch it. But number 3 is Woody Allen's Manhattan, which just does an amazing job of painting the city in black and white to the George Gershwin songs.
Yeah, I can understand.
King Kong is as close as we come to horror of my choices.
Yeah, I can understand how Manhattan, in retrospect, that kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth now.
I can watch a lot of Woody Allen movies. I mean, I can't blacklist them all, but that one, just because of the relationship with Mariel Hemingway's character and the fact that I do know, I don't, not to get into his whole thing, but I do know that he was grooming her. So it's very difficult to watch that on screen.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas Purple Rose of Cairo, Bullets Over Broadway, movies that he's not in, and even some that he's in, I can watch, and these thoughts aren't even going to come into my mind.
Yeah, that is difficult. I'm a big fan of the original King Kong. I only saw it probably a couple of years back, and it still stands heads and tails. And I love Peter Jackson's 2005 version, what he's trying to do, and trying to give that movie kind of new life. And by including all of the scenes that they left out. But the original King Kong still stands way above it and there's like no other remakes are going to be able to touch that.
No, nothing can reproduce the excitement and magic that the first one had. Although people who start by watching the other ones and then see that as an afterthought, they'll think otherwise. I've been fortunate to see it on a big screen 3 or 4 times. So,
oh, that is amazing.
No, Kong is amazing. I'm a huge Fay Wray fan, like huge, and I think she's the underrated special effect of that film because she plays off something patently unreal better than anyone today does off a green screen. It's amazing.
Awesome. She's awesome. The whole cast in that movie is really good.
Yeah. Are you a big classic monster or a classic horror fan?
Lauren, you took my question.
I would say.
Then ask it. Go ahead.
So, yeah.
So like the 30s are my decade for horror films, definitely. Have you seen the film Black Moon with Fay Wray?
I have not.
Change that. It's so good. It could never be made today, but it's so good. If you love Kong, it's a great counterpart to it.
I did just recently rewatch twice The Most Dangerous Game, which of course was filmed almost simultaneously with King Kong in the same sets.
Yeah, I love that film as well. That film is actually surprisingly modern too. Like that hasn't aged poorly, I don't think at all.
I don't think it has. I thought it really held up.
Yeah, but this isn't the Fay Wray show. Although I can easily make it that.
I'd be okay with that. That'd be a weird little spinoff.
I want to talk a little bit about Slime City Massacre. So you come back to would it offend you if I said your best known work is Slime City?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So you come back to Slime City, which has this legendary reputation for the sequel. And the thing that I was initially kind of hesitant because I was like, lightning in a bottle. Can you do it again? But it is remarkably in the spirit of the original film. So how did you go get yourself back into that headspace?
So my 2 films after Slime City each had half as much money for a budget as the one before it, which is not the trajectory you want to be going in. But the VHS market collapsed right after Slime City. I didn't do it. I didn't cause the market to collapse. But I was one of the last films to get in there and get paid in advance and get some decent distribution before my distributor went to prison for killing 2 people.
And not distributing Slime City. That's not what he went to prison for.
I realized that my career was not going to go where I wanted it to, making these micro-budget films. I had come into a little bit of lawsuit money, and I was married, and I had taken care of my mother when she was in hospice, and my wife and I decided that we wanted to come back to Western New York to start a family. So my plan was to take all these scripts that I had in a drawer that would be too big budget for the type of films that I could make, that I was capable of making, and to start turning them into novels and to attract them, to try and attract movie interest in them. And I've actually had some interest. Craig Sheffer optioned one of my novellas, Carnage Road, which we still work on off and on. George Mihalko, who directed the original My Bloody Valentine, has my 6 Jake Hellman books under option. So I've got 7 books in play, basically, so to speak. But I'm waiting for other people's schedules. I'm totally at their mercy. George had just attracted an A-list star to be part of Jake Hellman when George himself was hired to go to Hungary for 2 years and produce and direct a $80 million Game of Thrones type miniseries. So I'm here doing my own thing while he's out there running a show, but building up credibility. So maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. That's the way it always is with book options. But I came home with that purpose, and I was surprised when the digital technology came out. I was surprised by the quality of it. And I was never satisfied with any of my previous 3 films. I consider the 3 of them my film school background. And I really wanted to make just one film to prove to myself that I could make a movie that made me happy. And to this day, I've done bigger films. That is the one that I'm happiest with. And I just had all sorts of crazy ideas of making it a tribute to 80s films and throwing in some sci-fi references and just making it as crazy as I could, as sharing the same DNA as the first film, but plot-wise being as different as you can imagine, but making it a film aimed at fans of the original. And that was my whole approach to it. And I went into that film saying, I don't care if I can never make another film. I just want to make this one the best as I can. And because of that digital technology, I was able to make this sequel 22 years later with a larger cast. Debbie Rochon, Brooke Lewis, both parts of it. Keelan Patrick Burke was one of my leads, for the exact same budget that I made the original. And that's with a lot more effects and putting people up that I didn't have to worry about the first time. So that really speaks to what the technology allows you to get away with these days.
So you say that the Jake Hellman Files series is optioned. So my question there for you is, would you want, if you had your way and it was your decision, you're the signature at the bottom of the only file that matters, would you start with Personal Demons, or would you start at a different part in the series? And I ask that because in a way I feel like something like Cosmic Forces would probably be a little bit more commercial as a jumping off point.
Well, here's the thing. Serialization is what runs TV these days. And those books were heavily serialized. I was inspired by the TV show Wise Guy, which did the continuing storylines long before, what we're in now, where people do a story over the course of a season. And if they're going to be at all faithful to my books, they really do have to follow that sequence and the character development. Now, that being said, the TV show Hannibal proves that the right showrunner can come in and just mix everything up and throw them out of order. And if they get a genius storyteller to come up with a way to do that, I'm all for it. Our expectation is that we would do it one book, one season, the second book, the next season, and so on. I'm sure dealing with George that they'll come up, the hire writers will have all their own ideas on what to do to that storyline. One of my plans, the only reason I started writing books really was to tell that story and to tell the sequels. And I had planned to do 10, and Medallion told me when I submitted the outline for 6, this is going to be the last one. So I had to kind of, I didn't jump ahead to the ending that I had in mind, but I did have to condense a few things, skip a book I'd planned to do. So I have 2 Jake Hellman books that I plan to do. One is, I developed a show Bible that broke down Personal Demons into 10 one-hour episodes. None of those new storylines will be used, I guarantee it. They'll hire a story editor and he'll come up with his own. Right. But I happen to love what I did. So I would like to do a greatly expanded Personal Demons that incorporates all these extra stories that I developed. And then I never got to write the ending that I wanted. Anyone who reads the 6 books will think, oh, there's a happy ending at the end of book 6. But that was really just a setup for what I wanted to do next. So there's one more book that I plan to do. I'm not looking for a publisher. I think I'll self-publish it. One of the Indiegogo reward perks that I'm doing for Guns of Eden, the action movie I'm shooting this summer, is I am doing a novelization of early versions of the screenplay. It's another screenplay I wrote 25 years ago. So I'll learn what I need to about self-publishing with that. And then that book will automatically become part of the option, part of the package. So they'll have the rights to that as well.
So something like the Frenzy Wolves books, would you want to adapt them yourself, or would you rather them be picked up by someone else? Or would you consider adapting them yourself?
Well, I would love to see them done as big budget films. So that means somebody else. But I will tell you, I am shooting Guns of Eden this summer, but my hope next winter of 2022, is to do a werewolf movie that has Frenzy in the title. So it's not an adaptation of one of those books, but it's sort of in the same universe. And it'll be the first really scary film that I've done.
Ooh, I'm excited. I actually wanted to ask you something about Slime City, because, just having watched it and not having seen it for the first time, what struck me is that I'm always bitching about there are no horror movies to talk about alchemy, and no motherfuckers on Twitter be like, "Hey, go watch Slime City," because I thought that was something that's completely really underused in most horror films. So, do you have any sort of interest in alchemy? Because I noticed some weird little touches here and there.
I really don't. And when I wrote the script, I don't work from an outline usually or index cards. I just got to the point of the script where I said, okay, in most movies, this is where some character will give us all the exposition and tell us what's causing all this. And at that point, I made up the whole thing about this guy, Zachary, and his cult. Did you see Slime City Massacre as well, the sequel?
I unfortunately did not, because I can't find it anywhere streaming, and
Yes.
it's like driving me crazy.
Well, the thing that I did with that was that because we did it, it's funny, when we did Slime City, he turns over the book and he sees Zachary the Alchemist, and it's the same actor who plays the lead, my friend Robert Sabin. Well, we made the sequel 22 years later, so sort of like The Godfather 2, I have flashbacks throughout showing the cult. And he was old enough that he could play that character then. So I like to say that I set that up, and we had to wait 22 years for him to get old enough. But instead of going the alchemy route, we went a whole different direction and made him sort of a Jack Kerouac type character surrounded by beatniks and stuff. I don't really have an interest in alchemy. No, I tried playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was in high school. I liked the science fiction game Gamma World better. That was a role-playing game back then.
Well, I told Lauren this was going to get esoterically weird, so everybody buckle up. So I have there's a shot about 36 minutes into Slime City where Alex is going into Nicole's apartment, and there's there's a shot of like an arm, kind of a disembodied arm hanging in the doorway, and then on the other side there's some sort of bronze-looking statue, and so. Weird thing. There was a good amount of alchemy way back in old Bohemia, like 1500s, 1600s. And one of the minor coat of arms of Bohemia was an arm coming out of a doorway, although it was holding a sword because that was supposed to represent the alchemical fire. And because I'm a giant nerd, I lost my shit, and so I had to ask you about that. But I couldn't figure out what the statue, that other statue was, because I'm seriously like, oh, it's all coded language. Greg Lamberson's secretly an alchemy geek.
Well, the trick to making, I'm going to say, a good movie. I'm not particularly a fan of Slime City, my first film, but I can enjoy it. I have a laugh when I watch it. Is to hire or get to work for you for free the best people you can. And my production designer on that was a woman named Bonnie Brinkley, who went on to work on a couple of other acclaimed indie films after that. And she had about a budget of about $500 for the whole film. And she is responsible for everything you see in Nicole's apartment. Now, the funny thing about that apartment is a friend of mine was staying there. He knew he was going to move out. He said we could put paper mache on the walls to give him texture. Well, without asking me, she asked him if she could put actual plaster on the walls. So she destroyed this whole apartment. And 6 months later, I'm working as the assistant director to Frank Henenlotter on Brain Damage. And I get a call in the production office, and it's the woman who owned the building, who's furious that she's had to rent the apartment out to some people and couldn't claim a security deposit. And her son, he wasn't exactly mafia, but he was a thug, and she was threatening to send him after us. And my good friend, Peter Clark, who has since passed away, he was the cameraman on Slime City. He said, we should kill him before he gets us. Now, I was the guy who would talk people out of bad ideas. So we did not kill this woman's son. That didn't happen. But it was discussed. And nothing came of the whole thing, fortunately. There were no lawsuits or anything. But
yeah, this is getting into like Texas Chainsaw Massacre territory now.
It could have gone down a much darker turn than just losing distribution for 7 years.
Holy crap. That is wild.
I just love the fact that Sam watches the movie and she's looking for symbolism. And I was like, when I first saw it, I was like, look, it's a girl not wearing pants attacking a brain that's crawling across the floor with a the cleaver. That we came from it from very different places, I think.
Like I said, I was 18 when I wrote it. Yeah, there wasn't the subtext in that film is the alcohol, the sexual frustration, the drug addict, nothing else.
Can't spell alchemy without alcohol.
This is true.
And if you have alcohol, you probably can't spell it at all.
You may not be able to.
Yeah.
That's elixir is hard enough.
Touche. I was thinking about making elixir to go with my Slimerita, but I don't have any green food coloring. So
every couple of years, I have to look up the spelling of Himalayan.
Google. Yeah. That's what that Google is our friend. I just let Google do all my spell checks.
Well, I get frustrated when a Word document will underline a word for me to tell me that it's misspelled, but then you do the right-click thing and it's supposed to give you the correct spelling, and it just looks at you like you're weird and tries to change the word entirely. I get frustrated, and I almost think like, oh, I'm going to erase the whole sentence then. Fuck you. I get very vindictive at all Microsoft products at that point.
When I write this novelization of Guns of Eden, which I have to begin very soon, it'll be my first time working without an editor, and I'm going to be very paranoid thanks to Word.
Yeah, just be like, I use a lot of stylized punctuation, and you know when you talk to an editor, there's always the things you go, okay, listen, here's the thing, I don't use exclamation points ever, I do this instead, and usually they get it and they're like, okay, I get it. But like, no, Microsoft is all about like their way or the highway. So just, I'm not going to tell you to turn that shit off, but grain of salt, definitely.
I had a different experience working with my editors at Medallion, and they all did a great job. And they had to keep a style sheet with all the continuity from book to book, which saved my butt many times. They would say, no, this doesn't work. But, I'm from the school that you don't use adverbs. And they would keep suggesting adverbs, and I'd say, no, this is frowned upon. Haven't you read, Stephen King's On Writing?
I have. I know what you're talking about. I can't get that out of my head.
I'm not totally anti-adverb. I think like anything, it can be overused or misused as a part of speech. There's no question about it.
They serve their point, and they do sometimes improve a sentence.
Well, it's about real estate, right?
But I worked hard to avoid them, and that was my style. And they would add an ly and ly, and eventually I would get the style sheets, and one editor would say to the other, "Greg does not like to use adverbs," blah blah blah. And it would be all laid out for them, so that was cool.
Yeah, I just think Steve King said something, which his early books don't even follow the rule, but and people took it real serious, and it became a thing for me. It's like, oh, if you're going to spend 2 sentences trying to do what you could do in 1 word, then you know what, the adverb stays. That's just my take.
I'm a big fan of Steve King's Entertainment Weekly columns that he used to do. They were about 4 pages long.
Yeah. Griffin has a question in the chat. I'm going to paraphrase it because I think he wants to know if you read or were a fan of the Del Abyss line. And I think I need to give a little bit of backstory here, is that a lot of the Del Abyss authors, as well as the editor, Gene Cavellos, has been on the show. And I think there's, in this community, a lot of people who feel this was a high point of horror fiction from a commercial standpoint, from like a mass market standpoint, was the Del Abyss line. Did you have any connection with those books when they came out?
In the 80s, I would read 3 or 4 paperbacks a week on the subway, just going back and forth to work. And I did read quite a few books from that line. None jump out at me as being a big influence or anything, but there was so much horror being published at that time, you couldn't keep up with it. And a lot of it was garbage. There was a lot of there was a lot of great covers with really bad books inside. But I would finish them all because most of the garbage books were only 200 pages long. You didn't have to go 500 pages for a knockoff.
Yeah, I read every one of those B.W. Batten books that came out, and they were all the same exact story. There was like 8 of them, and they were all exactly the same, but I read every one of them. So I think that was an interesting period as a horror reader, is that there was so much variety, and yet there was so much of all the same. So it was a good time, and it was kind of a horrible time at the same time.
I was a big fan of Terry Wright's books, T.M. Wright's books, which were so weird. And even the sequels had big differences from book to book. And he was actually the judge of the publishing contest for Personal Demons that got it its first limited edition run. And I was really sad when he died. He lived about 2 hours away from me, and he had fallen on really hard times. Like, he was living in a trailer and had all sorts of medical problems. And I had actually made plans with his wife to come out there and visit them, because he was blind at that point, and take my infant daughter with me. And we had a snowstorm, and I couldn't make it. And a few months later, he was gone. But he was a big influence on me, just as far as being somebody who did stuff that I thought was really different.
Yeah, it's one of my notches is that I was in an anthology with Terry Wright, Darkness on the Edge, which I might look, that book is just an amazing table of contents, and I'm very proud to be in there. But being with Terry was definitely a big deal for me.
You know, that A Manhattan Ghost Story was optioned over and over and never became a movie. And
which I don't understand.
That's the perfect example of how an option doesn't really mean anything. It's nice that there's somebody out there interested, and maybe something could happen. Ian Rogers had, was it a short story or a novella, a haunted house thing, that I remember him telling me 6 years ago was optioned. Same time Jake Hellman was optioned. And Netflix has just finally given that the go-ahead. They're finally going to do not a series, which I thought was the plan, but a TV movie about it.
Well, I guess I can say as much as he said on this show during the Writers Roundtable, but you know, for years Brian Hodges had things that were optioned, and something's finally going forward for television. So, you know, I guess it's one of those waiting games, really.
Yeah, it is.
Which that's long overdue. That's ridiculously overdue. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the film Naked Fear.
Mm-hmm.
Probably in many ways your slickest production. Is that fair?
No. Johnny Gruesome and Widow's Point, which stars Craig Sheffer, those are both much slicker. I mean, those look like real movies. Naked Fear is a movie that we made for about $10,000 on a format that was supposed to revolutionize independent filmmaking. It was called High 8 Video, and it was going to change everything. Yes. And it was the worst format, with all sorts of dropouts in picture and sound that caused me, it took me 5 years to finish that film, because I had to dub the whole thing. And but it's the cheapest one I made, and the worst looking one, I think. It might be the most, it might be the most. I mean, the other one, the first two were made on 16 millimeter, which is a very expensive format that requires you to make a negative and make a print and color time the print. And it just takes much more work. Naked Fear, we had myself, my assistant director, and a cameraman who didn't know how to use the camera. He had just bought the camera, and we were paying him a small fee, which allowed him to pay the camera off. So the three of us were doing the sound and the lighting, and we did the first night of shooting, and it looked so bad that I said, okay, we're going to have to redo this entire night, which cost us an extra $500 and sent us way over budget. I'm glad you think it looks slick.
Maybe slick isn't the word. Maybe if that's throwing you, but I think that film has. I definitely think that film looks like something.
Well, I think it's an interesting film. It was an attempt to do a straight thriller instead of some sort of supernatural horror film. And it starred the lead of my first film and the lead of my second film. And I've always been a huge fan of The Odd Couple. And that was really the premise. What if you had two roommates who did drive each other crazy? One has agoraphobia, one has claustrophobia, and one of them's a serial killer. But it was super cheap, and it's super short. And every few years, I meet somebody who likes it, which surprises me that they've even seen it. I know it's available on Amazon for 99 cents, so people can run out and check it. When it was released on video, it was really just an extra feature on DVD. It was an extra feature on the first Slime City DVD. I couldn't even get a distributor to pick it up. I had to give it away.
It's weird because I'm usually against special features because anything that increases the cost of movies, I'm usually against, which is why I have a vendetta against slip sleeves. What are they? on
So,
Blu-ray.
right.
Yeah,
Perfect.
because they increased the cost, and I believe if we got movies cheaper, more people would be apt to buy them rather than just stream them. How do you feel about the whole physical media, the vanishing landscape of physical media?
Well, I have about 1,000 DVDs behind me, not as many as some people have, I'm sure. I'm frightened about physical media going away because most streaming deals for indies don't have any money up front. And it takes a long time to see royalties. What happens is when you put a film up for streaming, what these sales agents and distributors do is they recoup a certain figure, which is agreed on in the agreement, which basically pays them for all the time they put into trying to sell the film. When you get to the point where you would start seeing royalties, the next thing you know, it's up for free on Amazon Prime, which gets them publicity, but really makes pennies for filmmakers. We make more on Tubi than we do. For a while, horror seemed to be the collector's market still for physical media, and I think that's going to be the way for a few years. But for more mainstream films, it's going to disappear, and it's frightening. It's giving more power to the streamers. The internet is the worst thing that ever happened to independent films because it just means people ripping you off and watching your movies for free. And you know, when we started in publishing, there was a big backlash against anthologies that would say you're writing for exposure. Well, you write you write a short story for exposure, and you know, it's only the harm is only so much. Spend 2 years working on a film that investors have put money in, and a distributor ends up giving your movie away, and it's a much bigger loss.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you know, I really don't want to see physical media go away at this point because we are going to lose those special features, and we're not going to be able to hear the stories of this, you know, of lesser known films, and that's a big loss of itself because, you know, like if I Google Slime City, it's like, yes, of course, obviously your movie comes up, but then I'm like Ghostbusters, like six searches through. I try on DuckDuckGo, I got something similar. You know, and I don't want to see those. I don't want to see all that extra info, all that behind the scenes stuff go away. You know,
yeah,
doesn't have that.
A lot of people wonder, should they go to film school or should they get set experience? And the feeling the last few years is that unless you're going to be a writer or director and you need a sense of film history that you don't have, you can self-teach yourself a lot with your commentary tracks. You know, the combination of reading books and listening to commentary tracks, you can learn a lot. And film school really isn't as necessary as it was back in the 70s and 80s, you know, when everyone wanted to be Spielberg and Lucas and everyone was going to film school. Yeah, it would be a loss. But it would be a loss of so many other things. It would be a loss of films being discovered. It's hard to discover some obscure little thing on a streaming platform, you know?
Yeah.
I worry about the next big extinction event. You know, it's often said that, you know, we lost half the movies made before 1950 just to time and age and improper storage and media right issues. I think we could be looking at another one because the truth is, say some obscurity from 1952, right? What streaming service is going to bother with it? I mean, right now it's probably sure, but in 20 years from now, with physical media gone, is there even going to be a home for that film? And how many years after that does it become functionally a lost film or unavailable to anyone who might discover it? That I think there's a wide cast of film that could be just simply lost. And that's that's why I spent the last 2 years buying basically every 30s horror film that's in print at this moment in physical media. I mean, because I just, you know, I'm not worried about the 70s and 80s stuff. They'll always have a home, right? But older stuff, anything older than that, I do get very worried about the future for those films.
I have a lot of friends who spend their lives watching TCM, and I kind of understand why. When I first got Netflix, there were a lot of classic films, a lot. Now you're lucky if you can find 2 or 3. You know, that's a whole nother thing, that void that is Netflix. And even modern, I mean, a film comes out and for a week everyone's talking about it because it's a new film on Netflix, but 2 weeks later you kind of don't remember what it was and they've stopped advertising it themselves, And if you haven't seen it in the first 3 weeks, you probably aren't going to. It's sucked into that weird digital void.
It breaks my heart that people are more likely to watch the most recent Blumhouse direct-to-stream film than watch Bava's Black Sunday. That's a crime. That is an absolute crime.
I just had the most recent Blumhouse direct-to-Hulu film on today. I actually didn't watch it because I was working on it, but I put it on for background noise. I couldn't tell you if it's good or not. But yeah, that's what's available. And Hulu is like a huge market for indie films like that. Hulu and Shudder, if you can crack those markets, you're doing pretty well now. The DVD just doesn't matter. The DVD Blu-ray is not what it used to be. It isn't what it used to be a year ago.
No, that's true. In the last 5 years, it's something like 87% of the market has disappeared. So you tell me how much longer it can even go on. You know, I mean, yes, the boutiques have a bit longer than that, but once the manufacturing of the hardware really ceases, it's not even a matter of the clock running. Then the clock ran out at that point. I think. Yeah. But so. Go ahead, Sam. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to step on you.
Well, we were talking about physical media. I was wondering if there is a piece like there's VHS or a DVD that's like special for you that you own personally. I mean, other than your own movies.
Yes. I wore out my DVD of Assault on Precinct 13, and I got the Blu-ray, and I've lost the Blu-ray, and now I'm looking online, and it's very hard to get the Blu-ray. U.S. version. I was able to find one direct from Shout itself, but that's my comfort food. That film, I can watch it 2 or 3 times a month.
That's awesome.
I can completely see that in your work, though.
And another one would be Mean Streets, which I pull out usually a month before I start a film, not because I want to be influenced anyways, but I'm always so impressed with just what a personal movie it is and what the commitment is to it. And for some reason, anytime I watch that film, I end up watching it 2 or 3 times in a week. I just watch it over and over. I love that movie.
Nice. That's awesome. I mean, like I used to, not to keep going about special features, but I'm a big fan of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I had the first DVD box set when it came out back in the 90s. And there was that 8th DVD that was literally just navigating through a maze of Freddy's house lair thing, and it was nothing but Easter eggs, and you would just try and like solve puzzles and find new Easter eggs, and it was all just a bunch of really random shit that you can't that you're not gonna find now. Like, good luck. All that shit gone. If you didn't have that original box set, you're fucked. So, I mean that's the biggest regret that I no longer own that.
I have the edition of The Wicker Man that came in the wooden box with the Wicker Man burned on the front.
Yes.
And I went to play it over Halloween because my daughter's willing to watch some horror films now, and I had a defective disc. There's no way I can replace it. So I've been looking at that box, waiting for the time when I could watch that movie, and I had to stream it.
That makes my heart hurt.
Yeah, it was a rough night. My wife said, "Well, you can just buy a copy, one of the other editions, and stick it in there." It's like, don't.
It's not the same.
Don't understand.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about Guns of Eden.
I wrote, when I was managing the Angelica, I wrote an action script with a female hero, which even though we had, Ripley in Aliens and Sarah Connor in The Terminator, more often than not, the female heroines in action films back then were getting revenge for rape or were martial artists. They didn't have the same volume and variety that the male heroes had. And if I'd made the film back then, it would have been pretty radical. But it was a script that just wasn't quite there. It was about 85% there. So I put it in a drawer, as I often do, and every few years I come back to it. And I had, just before the pandemic, I had started working on it again, was starting to flesh it out. And then the pandemic came, and I was planning to do this werewolf movie last winter, the winter we're just coming out of. And the pandemic hit, and there was no way I could do a movie with 7 characters in an enclosed space safely. But this film is basically a female first blood, and 90% of it takes place outdoors. And so whereas it had been a daunting project before, because there's so many characters and a helicopter and all these crazy action scenes, it was actually the easiest film in terms of making a film safely in this. And I've spent much of the last year just rewriting it obsessively, making it one of the best scripts I've written. And I decided I was going to make it. And I did a crowdfunding campaign. I reached for $70,000 and I ended up making $84,000 after we give the fees to the bank and Indiegogo and stuff. It's much less. It's about 72, but I have to set a certain amount of money aside for all the perks because we have some fairly elaborate perks, including the limited edition novelization. But I've been casting the film for months already. I had my lead picked out even before I started the campaign. And we raised enough money that I was able to cast a couple of people that I hoped I could put into it, like Debbie Rochon and Lynn Lowry. And we're going to be shooting it in mid-July. And I was hoping to shoot in June just because I was chomping at the bit to work on another movie. The last film I worked on was Assault on VA 33. I was assistant director on this Chris Ray action film that just came out. And I worked on that a year ago in December. And then we headed right into the pandemic right after that. So I was chomping at the bit to work on this in June, but I said, there's a good chance that the vaccine will be available, that we'll have an even safer scenario. And if there's any way I can make it safer, the people that I'm going to involve in this, that's what I got to do. So I pushed back to mid-July. And as it turns out, everyone in my crew will be vaccinated. Most of the actors will be, and we'll have a much safer experience out there in the woods running around shooting guns.
Team Moderna.
Fake guns. I'm Pfizer.
We'll see which one of us does better. Jess Graham he's going to get our last question in for the night. And that is, did Greg talk about his experience on I Was a Teenage Zombie? Well, he mentioned it.
Yeah, I can talk about that. Kind of interesting. I had, as I said, I'd already written this. When I first got to New York City, my first movie theater job was called Cinema One on 3rd Avenue. And I was working in the concession stand, and I worked with a girl named Alice Martin, who had worked on a slasher film called Splatter University, which hadn't been released yet. Now I'm like, hey, I've been living in New York City 2 weeks, and I've already met an actress who was in a slasher movie. And a year later, that movie was playing in Times Square, and I went and saw it. And a year later, I was managing the RKO National Twin on 43rd and Broadway, and the doorman asked if I could let in a friend of his who had worked on a movie. I said, oh, sure, you can let him in. And what movie did you work on? He said, well, I was the assistant director on Splatter University. Oh, great. What are you doing now? I'm getting ready to direct my first film called I Was a Teenage Zombie. Can I work on it? Well, you have to work full time and there's no money. I said, okay. I went to a production meeting a couple of days later. As soon as they were ready, I quit my job and I went and worked on this film as a production manager. I didn't know what a production manager was, but I figured I'll learn. And I learned as much working on that film as I learned in my year at film school. So it was definitely a worthwhile thing. I knew I was going to make Slime City, and I wanted to work on a similar low budget film to figure out how things were done. So it was good that I was the production manager. Peter Clark, my cameraman in Slime City, was the assistant cameraman. I got him in on that. And Robert Sabin, who was the star of Slime City, played one of the 5 high school students, sort of the diner cast. So basically my key guys, I got in there on this film and we all worked together and figured out how it would be done. And if anyone wants to become a filmmaker, has a chance to work on a film for free, do it, because you'll learn so much.
Great attitude for sure. I'm all about on-the-job training.
Yeah, no, it's just
getting paid. Doesn't matter.
It's tougher these days because different states have different labor laws, but filmmakers just tend to ignore those anyways.
Exactly.
But I mean, nothing beats working 12 hours a day. Hopefully you get fed. I didn't get fed a lot of days on I Was a Teenage Zombie. In fact, I remember one day sitting at Brooklyn College with everybody. We were all starving, and the assistant director brought a sandwich to the director, and we all sat there and watched him eat the sandwich. So that was a low point for sure. But other than that, it was a good experience.
At least it didn't go full Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, it did not. It couldn't. Not at Brooklyn College with all those students walking around.
Too many witnesses.
So, Greg, how can the audience follow along with what you're doing? And is there anything you'd like to point them in the direction of?
Well, I am very happy that after 2.5 years of being off of Amazon Prime, as are several of my films, because Amazon Prime has a habit of putting independent horror films up for free, milking them for all they're worth, and then yanking them down under some sort of offensive community standards BS. Killer Rack, which is a movie I'm very proud of and sort of exists in the Slime City universe, is finally available on Amazon Prime again, and it's free. So if you're an Amazon Prime subscriber, please check out Killer Rack, which is a comedy that I'm very happy with. Debbie Rochon is brilliant in it. The lead actress is good. It's a really good film that I'm proud of. As far as following me, Facebook is really where I post most of my stuff. All of my different film titles, for the most part, have their own pages. You can also see Johnny Gruesome and Widow's Point for free on Tubi. So you don't have to pay a whole lot of money to see my films. And if you watch those films for free, we'll make a few nickels.
And then you can always throw money and actually buy the physical copies.
That's true. Get them while you can. My crowdfunding campaign for Indiegogo is actually still active. We were so successful that we're in what's called the in-demand section. So it's still there if anyone wants to get the perks. Indiegogo.com, Guns of Eden.
Sweet.
Awesome. Greg, thank you so much for coming on and talking today. We really appreciate it. We love independent cinema. We think it is vital to the genre. The major studio, they can produce something great every once in a while. There's no question about it. But we love things that feel like they were made by human hands from someone with their own set of eyes. And you are a poster child for that, sir.
Thank you. It's funny, during this pandemic, my family finally watched all of these Marvel superhero films, and not to criticize them, they're great for what they are, but it kind of numbs my brain seeing just how CGI these things are and how they're always operating against a green screen. And I know the fanboys are thrilled that these things are being made, but that's primarily all that's being made. That's where the bulk of the production money is going. So independent cinema, which is really having a hard time during this pandemic, is definitely something that should be supported.
100%.
On that note, I mean, there's nothing more that can be said. Keep your eyes open on the channel, because we will be recording a few very special episodes in the next week, including the second round of the Writers Roundtable. So that's certainly something you don't want to miss at all. Any parting shots, guys?
Cheers!
The slime must be appeased, Sam.
I'm appeasing it as fast as I can, Greg.
It's good talking to both of you.
Thank you, and good night.